In this lesson, we'll learn a little bit about the anatomy of letter forms. Alright, so in the previous lesson, we learned a little bit about type terminology. Now, I'm going to be working with the project file 04_begin in this lesson if you want to follow along there at home. So I have in front of me here some letter forms. Now, these letter forms actually have anatomical features, much like the human body does. Now, obviously, they're going to be named something different, and they're probably not going to have much to do with the human body, but there are a lot of different components here that work together to make up each one of these letter forms. Okay, so let's go ahead and start by talking about the three horizontal lines that travel through this type. Now, these are invisible lines. Let me go ahead and bring in some visual representations of those for you here. Alright, let's go ahead and talk about this line at the top first. This is actually called the cap line, or the cap height of this typeface. This is the height of all the uppercase letters in this particular typeface, which is Adobe Garamond, by the way. Now, let's go ahead and bounce down to the bottom of the letter forms, and you can see here that we have the baseline. Now, this baseline is the invisible line that all these letter forms rest on. Now, I know that several of these letter forms have pieces that actually extend below the baseline. We'll talk about those here in just a moment. Now, the third invisible line we have here is the X height, and it's named this because it is the height of the lowercase letter x for the typeface. So you can see that this invisible line runs through really the top of most of these lowercase letters. Now, again, just like we had with the baseline, we have exceptions to the X height, whereas is exhibited here by the lowercase letter h. We'll also talk about that here in just a moment. I tell you what, let me go ahead and bring in some highlights for you on some of the different features we're going to talk about here. So I'll go ahead and reveal that layer. And if you remember in the previous lesson, we talked briefly about this foot shape. Now, I mentioned we'd come back to that. This little foot shape here is actually called a serif. Let me go ahead and bring in the descriptions here of each of these. So we'll go ahead and zoom in on that. And now you can see here that in this case, the serif is right-angled, but serifs can also be oblique. And it's quite simply this foot shape at the end of a stroke. Now, that word stroke is something we also don't really know what that means. So let's go ahead and bounce over here to the lowercase letter o, and you can see that I've highlighted the stroke for this letter form. Now, the stroke is just simply any line that defines the basic form of a letter. So each one of these letter forms has a stroke. Now we'll go ahead and move over here to the left of that letter O, and I told you that we would come back to these pieces of the letter forms that actually went below the baseline. These parts of those letter forms are actually called descenders. And if we zoom out here, you can actually see that there are 5 different letter forms in the word typography that have descenders on them. Now, it's real easy to remember this next term if you know what a descender is, because the parts of these letter forms that go above the X height for this typeface are called ascenders. That should be really easy for you to remember. And we've got next the counter. Now, you can see that it's highlighted here on the letter P, and this is an example of a letter form that has an enclosed counter. But counters don't have to be enclosed. They can either be partially enclosed or completely enclosed. Example of a partially enclosed counter would be, say for example, on the letter C. Okay, so really this is only a sample of the different anatomical features of each one of these letter forms. There's really so much more here, but this is about all we're going to talk about in this lesson. But let's go ahead and shift our attention back over here to this serif. Now, this serif may look familiar to you from the last lesson where we looked at some type classifications. Several of the typefaces that we had shown in that lesson for those type classifications actually have these serifs on them. And one of those classifications actually has the word serif in the name of it. If you remember, one of those classifications was called sans serif. Sans simply means without. I'm going to go ahead and bring in one last layer here. I'm going to show you an example of a sans serif typeface. Now, this is a fairly common sans serif typeface titled Myriad Pro, and just a little tidbit of information here is that the size of this typeface is actually the exact same size as this one right here. And I know that that looks a little bit off to you. It looks a little bit bigger. But the reason for this is that Myriad Pro actually has a higher X height than Adobe Garamond Pro does. Tell you what, let me come over here and I'm going to hide Adobe Garamond Pro. And let's go ahead and hide the descriptions. Actually, let's hide the anatomy here. Let's just drag up Myriad Pro so we can measure its X height based on Adobe Garamond Pro's. You can see here how much taller the X height is. You can see just about the same as far as the cap height and the ascender height, but the X height for Myriad Pro is much higher than what we had for Adobe Garamond Pro. Now what this results in is each one of these letter forms looks a little bit fatter because of that. Let me go ahead and undo back a few times here. Now there is one popular argument that typefaces with serifs are easier to read at smaller sizes than typefaces without serifs. This was long thought of to be the case, but recent developments and recent research actually has brought this into the forefront as an argument when it comes to type. We won't actually open that can of worms in this lesson, but we will pick up in the next lesson where we're leaving off here and learn how we can control the space between letter forms.